Natural disasters are another type of ecologic disturbance that can lead to an increase in infectious disease. This includes things like floods, hurricanes, earthquakes, drought, landslides, tsunamis, and volcanoes. Of these, a few of them are also related to climate change, including floods in some areas of the world, drought in other areas of the world, and the increased strength and severity and frequency of hurricanes. These different natural disasters displace populations and end up resulting in an increased burden of infectious disease. Whenever a natural disaster strikes, governmental public health institutions suffer. This includes water sanitation, providing clean water sources and eliminating pollution and contamination of water sources, and other public health institutions such as providing vaccination programs, medical care, and even in some areas of the world, clean bed nets. The public health infrastructure is extremely important in managing catastrophic events. In addition to that, especially in places like the United States, natural disasters can lead to a lot of flooding, such as we saw with Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. These floods can cause a lot of moisture to be retained in buildings, and that building moisture can end up leading to the production and development of mold contamination on a lot of houses and other areas. This mold can be a problem for human health and has led to, in the case of Hurricane Katrina, a disease known as Katrina cough as a result of the mold that was so prevalent in the area afterwards. Contaminated water was also a source of infectious disease spread, and individuals who walked through the flooded zones of New Orleans and other areas like Texas after these hurricanes with injuries or open wounds have been infected with various diseases, and some of which actually resulted in death. These contaminated floodwaters, polluted air, mold, and an increase in mosquito populations, combined with infected wounds, are all a cause of and consequence of natural disasters spreading infectious disease. Technological advances are also a cause of spreading infectious disease. Among these is air travel. Air travel has allowed people to move from one place in the world to another remote location within very short periods of time. We can see from this graph that with the advent of jet travel, people can travel really far distances and spread infectious disease even before they know they themselves are actually infected. Many of these travel times today are well within the incubation period of many different infectious diseases. The incubation period is the time when a person becomes infected with a disease and when they start to show symptoms and know that they are in fact sick. So many people can spread disease and not even know that they're ill. In addition, air travel has become so easy that it's in fact easy for people to hop on board a plane even when they're feeling unwell and spread disease and travel really far distances. This was the case in 2007 when an international flight from Russia to New York resulted in a person infected with tuberculosis spreading the disease to 13 other travelers. Have you ever hopped on board a plane or gotten into a car to travel really far distances even though you're sick? This used to not be possible over 100 years ago. It was very difficult to travel, and it took a very long time. And so travel itself ended up mitigating or reducing the risk of spreading infectious disease. But today, it allows for people to travel far distances and spread diseases much easier. This global travel has also led to infectious diseases that were once eliminated from the United States becoming prevalent in the US once again. It's not uncommon for measles to be contracted in the US this way. Most of the cases of measles in the United States have come from international or locations abroad. Typically, unvaccinated children contract measles when their families are vacationing in other countries, and then only show symptoms after they return. In 2015, a multi-state outbreak occurred of 189 measles cases in 24 states, including Washington, D.C. The epidemic was linked to exposure to a visitor infected with measles who went to Disneyland in Anaheim, California. Again, in January of 2019, there was a spread of measles across a few states, including particularly Washington and Oregon. This particular case of measles was first contracted by a teenager when he traveled to Asia, specifically in Vietnam. He was unvaccinated and ended up returning to the United States and spreading the disease to his unvaccinated brothers. They then ended up spreading the disease to other individuals, many of whom were also unvaccinated. The unfortunate aspect of measles is that there is a vaccine, but due to unfounded and irrational health concerns related to vaccines, parents are now less frequently vaccinating their children. We're going to talk a little bit more about this with human behavior and complacency later. The Ebola virus is also another important case of where we see the spread of infectious disease around the world. In 2014, an individual known as Thomas Eric Duncan flew from Monrovia, Liberia to Texas after being infected by the Ebola virus. He didn't have any symptoms at the time, but the short duration of the flight in comparison to the incubation period allowed him to bring the Ebola virus back to the US. Thomas Eric Duncan ended up developing symptoms when he was in the United States, transferred to a hospital, and infected 2 nurses there. Mr. Duncan ended up dying from the disease. Thankfully, the 2 nurses did not, but this is a case of spreading of disease that would never have happened prior to modern advancements in air travel. Air travel doesn't just allow for transmission of people, but it also allows for transmission of goods or items really far distances. These goods include food and also materials that can transmit insect vectors or carriers of infectious disease really far distances. Medical advancements also have led to the development and spread of disease. In some countries, blood and blood products may be hazardous to your health. The blood is not always screened in different areas of the world for agents such as HIV, hepatitis, syphilis, malaria, West Nile encephalitis, and trypanosomiasis. Organ transplantations have also led to the spread of infectious disease, including here in the United States. The reason for this is that not all diseases are screened for organ transplantation, and recipients are at an increased risk for infection because they're on a regimen of immunosuppressive drugs to minimize the rejection of the donated organ. There was a case in the last 5 years of organ transplantation resulting in the transmission of rabies because the donor did not realize that he had rabies when he died, and the hospital never thought to screen for it because it's such a rare disease. Microbial evolution and adaptation is also a major cause of the spread of infectious disease. The 1940s ushered in the dawn of antibiotics, where penicillin was the first antibiotic to be used, followed by a few others. In the United States now, each year 2 million people are infected with bacteria that are resistant to antibiotic treatments, and at least 23,000 people die each year as a direct result of these antibiotic-resistant infections. We're going to talk more about antibiotics and the development and evolution of antibiotic-resistant strains later on in this class. However, the important thing to recognize is that it's the microbe particularly in this case the bacterium, that evolves resistance to the antibiotic, not the person. So the expression, "I'm resistant to an antibiotic," has no meaning. People don't become resistant to antibiotics, their microbes do. Some refer to these antibiotic-resistant bacteria as superbugs. And this is a result of natural selection at play, where the antibiotics are the selecting factor. They are not causing the antibiotic resistance, but they select for the antibiotic-resistant strains, leaving only the antibiotic-resistant strains alive to infect others. This is not just true of bacterial evolution and resistance to antibiotics, but we also see the same thing happening with the evolution of pesticide resistance in insects. Insect vectors are also capable of evolving resistance to chemicals such as pesticides, and in doing so, allow for the spread of insect-carried disease. We saw this happen in the 20th century with DDT, a very potent type of insecticide that did an amazing job at killing many mosquitoes around the world. However, as a result of selective pressures, there are DDT-resistant mosquitoes today. Finally, the last factor attributed to the spread of infectious disease is human behavior and attitudes, the first and foremost of which is complacency. Complacency is belief that it can't happen to me, where individuals become lazy or unconcerned about issues that could impact them because they don't believe that they can be impacted by such frightening diseases. The failure of people to complete their full dose of antibiotics because they're feeling better is a prime example of this. If a doctor prescribes an entire course of antibiotics, it must be taken for the entire duration. But many people, once they're feeling better, quit the course of antibiotics, and this can lead to antibiotic resistance. Another example of complacency is evident in the resurgence of HIV and AIDS, particularly among young gay men, because of a return to risky sexual behavior, not using protective sex, such as condoms, because of the idea that there are new drug therapies that help manage HIV. We're also seeing this here in California with a resurgence in gonorrhea and syphilis here in the Bay Area, because people don't believe that it can happen to them, they don't use protected sex, and they don't get tested or screened for it. The worst HIV outbreak happened in the United States since the 1980s in a small rural town in Indiana in 2015. Individuals were injecting opioid painkillers, known as oxymorphone, illegally and without a prescription. Because it was illegal to purchase needles in Indiana unless you're diabetic or required a prescription drug, it was not possible to obtain sterile needles. And as a result, drug users were sharing needles and led to at least 170 individuals becoming positive for HIV infection. 80% of them were also co-infected with hepatitis C virus. People have also become complacent about receiving immunizations or keeping immunization boosters up to date. According to the CDC, only about 80% of 2-year-olds in the United States have been given the full sequence of currently recommended immunizations, primarily because of parents' complacency and concerns about vaccine safety. This has led to a rise in measles and mumps, 2 diseases that were once completely eliminated from the United States, and also whooping cough, which is on the rise and killing children in the United States more every year. We're going to finish up with human behaviors and attitudes in the next section, very briefly talking about human migration and societal factors.